Hello everyone, welcome back to Unraveling Politics, a show where I discuss the political news of the week. Obviously today is a very big day with the inauguration of the new president, Donald Trump, the new old president. However, I want to take some time and take a look back at the 4 years that have just come to an end. Obviously, there are strong feelings about the Biden administration, so I'm going to try to be as fair as possible, and I think there is some content I have here that's appealing to both liberals and conservatives. Just a warning, I am a bit of a hater, as my friends know very well, so impressing me is usually pretty difficult. However, this episode is targeted toward people who want a broad sweep of what has happened, and if you are interested in any specific details, I would be happy to do a special episode about any one of these topics. Please leave them in the YouTube comments. That being said, let's begin. So let's rewind the clock 4 years to January 20th, 2024. It's exactly 4 years ago. I remember that day very well. That's when Biden took the oath of office. At the time, he was 78 years old. He was already the oldest person to ever become president. As I'm sure you all remember, the inauguration took place under the shadow of the January 6th attack and the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we're not going to spend time discussing whether it was a riot or an insurrection. I prefer to call it an attack or a ransacking. But needless to say, the Biden administration had huge challenges to deal with both here at home and around the world, primarily the pandemic. So what happened in those first 100 days? Since Roosevelt's presidents have, specifically Franklin Roosevelt, presidents have set off their domestic agenda for the first 100 days. In his first 2 days, he signed 2 executive orders, and remember, or he signed up 20, I believe, 20 or 22, and consider that Trump is considering signing 100 executive orders. He also Biden rejoined the Paris Climate Accord. The World Health Organization, which we had begun the process of leaving under the Trump administration, required masks on federal property and ended the construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. Perhaps the biggest part of Biden's first 100 days was the signing of the American Rescue Plan, which was a $1.9 trillion economic stimulus bill, which also sent the $1,400 checks that I'm sure you remember, and it was provided economic relief to schools, hospitals, states, localities, and other organizations. Now, we can talk in the face until we are blue in the face about whether this has caused inflation. If you ask me, yes, it did. Did it cause all of the inflation of the last 4 years? There's no way it did. What I will say is that leading up to the vote, that was something that I was very concerned about, and several economists were concerned about that as well, including Obama-era economist Larry Summers. But we also have to consider that in the year before that, the Federal Reserve had pumped $1 trillion into the economy. President Trump had signed 2 very large economic stimulus packages, and one had just been signed in December of 2020, so a month before Biden took office. And those 2 stimulus packages combined were $3 trillion. That was an injection of almost $6 trillion into the economy. And then we had the invasion of Ukraine and the snarling of supply chains, which further raised prices. So did Biden cause all of the inflation? No, but he must have caused some of it. That is simply a fact. Some of it is his fault. Did he cause all of it? No, and I want to be very clear about that. That is the facts, and anyone that tells you otherwise, as such as certain political parties have done, are wrong. And particularly those on the left have said that inflation is global, and yes, that is true. It was/is global. But consider that actions that our government took were very similar to actions that peer economies did. Europe also pumped in hundreds of billions of pounds and euros into the economy. The Bank of England and European Central Bank also lowered interest rates to record lows. The Bank of Canada also lowered interest rates to record lows, and they pumped in tens, if not hundreds of billions of Canadian dollars. Various countries also sent out stimulus checks. So yes, inflation was global, but that was because most of our policies across the globe were the same. Also, beginning around this time, migrants began to enter the country illegally more and more. This to me shows that Biden's re-election chances were already going to be difficult. And this, of course, wasn't obvious back then, but it's obvious looking back. And this to me, because if you think about it, these are issues of inflation and immigration. They were sown at the very beginning of his administration, and in some cases well before his administration. At that time, though, we didn't understand just how bad it was going to be. Was the immigration surge his fault? I would say mostly yes, it was. We did see a decrease in 2020, which means that some of those people might have waited an extra year or two to make the travel. but the harsh reality of the because of the harsh reality of the pandemic in their home countries. However, Biden was not particularly harsh in his border policies. He wasn't as liberal as he could be, but he certainly wasn't as strict as Trump was. He retained Title 42 for a while, which allowed quick deportation back to Mexico, but Remain in Mexico was abolished, and eventually Title 42 was ended, and including the construction of the border wall came to an end. So that even though they were saying one thing where don't come, their actions were showing, yes, you can come. And then they also set up that weird app that was supposed to be for people to apply for asylum in their home countries. So Biden and Harris were more compassionate, but they also didn't want border crossings, which often left me very confused. Did they want people to come or no? They said they didn't, as I just mentioned, but they also didn't keep in place Trump's policies. I also want to address there were more deportations under Biden, and yes, that is true. But the Independent reported that 2 million were deported under Trump, 3.2 million in Obama's first term, and 2.1 million in Obama's second term, and that does include voluntary deportations. Biden had deported almost 5 million as of November 2024. Yes, Biden did deport more, but that's because many more people entered the country illegally under Biden. So naturally, there's going to be more deportations. Pew Research has some good information about this that I'm going to leave in the description if you're interested in looking about it. I don't want to get into all of it here. Next, over the summer, there is the withdrawal of troops from Afghanistan, America's longest war. This deserves its own podcast, and if there's any interest in it, please let me know and I can do that. But in April, he announced that all combat operations would end on September 11, 2021. This was a problem because the Biden administration had broken a deal established by Trump, where all U.S. forces would exit by May 1st. Instead, Biden said that's when the exit would begin. See the problem here? If a paper of mine for school is due on October 1st, I can't tell the professor that I will begin working on the paper on October 1st. Anyway, the Taliban was not happy, and they began to attack our coalition forces and slowly began to take over the country. Eventually, in mid-August, we had to evacuate Kabul, and 13 Americans died amid the chaos. It was definitely a low of the Biden administration, in my opinion. Was this his fault? Yes and no. We should have withdrawn years previous, and I understand the administration for wanting extra time, but also wanting to leave as soon as possible. The withdrawal could have been handled better, and one example is we left Bagram Air Base in the middle of the night, and we just turned the lights off, and we didn't even tell the commander that we were leaving. So, yes, it could have been handled a little bit better. But Biden said it was handled as best as possible. Then there was the whole incident where he was looking at his watch. Absolutely disgraceful. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken stated a collapse of Afghanistan would not be something that would happen from a Friday to a Monday, and that's exactly what did happen. Anyway, here at home, this is kind of a bit more on the positive note. Here at home, Biden focused on initiatives such as infrastructure investments, greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, gun safety changes in response to the Robb Elementary School shooting in Uvalde, Texas, and laws to improve healthcare access to veterans that were exposed to toxic substances, including burn pits, during their service. In late 2022, he signed the Respect for Marriage Act, which required the U.S. government to recognize the validity of same-sex and interracial marriages. This was already on the books, but this was reaffirmed in response to the Dobbs decision. It was because many liberals were concerned that the decision would be overturned, that Dobbs, although the Loving v. Virginia case, which legalized interracial marriage, there is no challenge to that. I mean, even Clarence Thomas, he's black, has a white wife. As I've told one of my friends, and he thought was very funny, overturning Loving v. Virginia would be a very elaborate way to get a divorce by Clarence Thomas, but I don't think there's no threat to Loving v. Virginia, and there really is very little threat to Obergefell, and I could explain that at another time. Anyway, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. As 2021 was coming to an end, we were facing another wave of the pandemic, and Biden began forcing Americans to get vaccinated, infamously stating that the refusal of the unvaccinated Americans to get vaccinated is, quote, is costing all of us, unquote. which never made sense to me because if your seatbelt works fine, why do I need to wear my seatbelt to make your seatbelt more effective? Anyway, this was around the time that Biden's approval rating began to turn negative. You can look at the graph. It was starting to decline by late spring, but it went negative at the end of the summer, right around the time of the Afghanistan withdrawal. And its approval rating never recovered. By the way, when I say it went negative, I mean his approval rating was below his disapproval rating. So it has never recovered, and now it never will. Going into 2022, there were several challenges the administration was facing: the end of the pandemic, inflation, and the brewing war in Eastern Europe. 2022 was easily, in my opinion, the worst year of the Biden administration, with 2021 and maybe 2023 being the best. Despite that, I think Biden's administration really shined during the war in Ukraine, and this is the kindest I'm going to be to him today. I'm recording this at night. I remember the outbreak of this war very vividly at the time. I was a senior in high school, and I was actually awake when the reports of bombs that began to fall in eastern Ukraine. It was around 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock Eastern time. I was on the phone with a friend. Anyway, leading up to the invasion, Biden and his administration implemented sanctions that were supposed to deter, at least according to them. Then the world took swift action to cripple the Russian economy, including more sanctions on Russia, closing off NATO and European airspace, as well as North American airspace to Russian planes, cutting off the Russian banking system from the international system, and placed an embargo on Russian oil, as well as a bunch of other things. These were all bold actions, no doubt, but unfortunately have not crippled the Russian economy in the same way that people thought it would at that time, and I remember it very well. Ukraine was successful in halting the Russian attacks, as we know, and regaining some of their land back, but the front lines have basically been a stalemate for 2 years with a couple of changes. So, yeah, that's kind of where we're at. I do appreciate Biden's handling of the situation in Ukraine. I think toward the end, more recently, not so much, but at the beginning, I think he was a good leader to do that. Now, I don't blame Biden for the start of this war. Instead, I choose to give him credit to help save the West, or to rally the West to save it, and without his leadership, it might not have gone nearly as well as it did. I also can't skip the Dobbs decision, which the court handed down in late June, that has so polarized our society. I don't have much to say here since so much has already been said, but I think this decision was one of the most consequential in this century in terms of politics, and I think the only thing that might rival that would be the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and maybe the decision of Bush v. Gore in 2000. That might be the only two things that are more consequential than the Dobbs decision. For the rest of the war, or the rest of the year, it went pretty badly. Inflation peaked at 9.1% in June, and there was also the baby formula shortage, which we don't have enough time to get into, and the midterm elections, which left Democrats in a shockingly stronger position than anticipated. So that was actually a bright spot. Democrats gained a seat in the Senate. Nobody really expected that, and they lost only 10 seats in the House of Representatives. It did cost them the majority, though, but I digress. The Democrats' performance left Republicans with the narrowest majority in decades and proved them to be so internally divided and unstable, and it left Democrats in a decent condition to retake the House in 2024, which, as we know, they didn't. Ultimately, the first 2 years of the Biden administration was legislatively comprehensive, but ultimately would be undermined by inflation and immigration, as we all know. He had historic investments in green energy, infrastructure, science, and technology that I think will prove its worth in the distant future, and I'll talk about that more in a little while. Going into 2023, Biden had to face a divided Congress and personal scandals. Here at home, his domestic agenda had been basically halted. In 2023 and 2024, legislatively, it has been very dead. I've talked about this in a previous episode. Not much got done in the last 2 years. Inflation has remained a problem, and the debt ceiling negotiations of the first half of the year before last has paralyzed Congress and his administration. Thankfully, they were able to agree to a debt ceiling increase, and we didn't end up defaulting on our debt. But that the debt ceiling agreement that was signed back then has expired, and the debt ceiling will need to be renewed in the middle of this year. The very end of 2022 is when the classified documents case broke out. And I don't mean Donald Trump's, I mean Joe Biden's. Many people forgot about this. But for weeks going into 2023, more and more and more classified documents were found at the Penn Biden Center for Research in Washington, and even more at his home in Greenville, Delaware. They were found in his garage, and some of them were over a decade old, going back to his time in the Senate. Just to be clear, many people don't know this, but when you are in Congress, you are not allowed to bring the documents outside of the room. You can't take pictures of them. You can't take notes of them. You're going to be in a room in the Capitol. You get to view them. There's guards at the door, and then when you're done, you leave the documents, and that is it. And I believe that room is locked when you go in. Anyway, if you or I had committed that crime, we would never see the light of day again. Never. We would be, I'm in my 20s, I'd be in prison until my 60s, for sure. However, one of the big reasons that Biden will never be charged with this crime is 1, he was the president, 2, he's wealthy, 3, he's senile, and 4, Trump had done a similar thing. And this whole incident was a gift to the Trump campaign, since it neutralized the issue politically. It really wasn't a problem. Again, yeah, Trump had the cases against him, but there was always why didn't you bring it against Biden? Why isn't Biden being charged? They were very similar cases. Trump's side would say is slightly worse, but not that much worse. Anyway, in 2023, immigration was still a problem. There's not much more I have to say about that. But the biggest and most polarizing event of Biden's presidency, other than maybe the Dobbs decision, is probably the October 7th attacks. Since this was a shock attack, unlike the invasion of Ukraine, I wasn't really aware of the importance of the attack until a few days later, because I'll admit I was thinking this was more like one of the border conflicts that you saw in 2021, where they were shooting rockets back and forth. But this was a big deal, and I didn't realize it until a couple days in. Lastly, I'll mention this was also the year that Biden's student loan forgiveness plan died, and truthfully, it was on life support ever since it was announced. It was like a baby that had basically no chance, and there was never a snowball's chance in hell that this was ever going to be approved. Lastly, 2024. This is the year that just ended, as we know, and probably the most eventful politically in a very long, long time. I would compare it to maybe 1968. Let's keep it brief, since we're gonna definitely run over. But there was the conflict in Europe and the Middle East. Inflation, immigration numbers were coming down, but they were still used against him. And of course, the day his re-election bid died on July 21st, when he withdrew from the race after the abysmal debate performance in June. And if you want to know just how bad it was, listen to my episode that I released the night of the debate. It wasn't so obvious back then, but I think most normal people, can agree that Biden had basically no chance of winning another term, despite what he says today. His age and mental decline was really a death by 1,000 cuts, kind of like Hillary's campaign. Hers was death by 1,000 cuts. And he was also running against Teflon Don, who nothing seems to stick to. When he said that he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it, I thought he was joking, but I actually think he might actually get away with it. Consider that Kamala did way more media events and rallies than Biden ever could, and she still lost. In the last week, he worked to negotiate a ceasefire deal in Gaza, as Jimmy Carter did, spent his last few days trying to negotiate a hostage deal with Iran. It looked like for a day or two that it might not make it, but it seems to be, as of the recording of this episode, that it's standing. So that is a big deal. And that brings us to today, January 25th, 2025, the mirror image of 4 years ago. In many ways, this administration has ended a complete opposite the way it began. In 2021, Trump was unpopular and Biden was more popular. Now it's flipped. Biden came into office riding a wave of optimism. Now Trump does. 4 years ago, we were gripping in a pandemic and facing a slowing economy. 4 years ago, there was mostly peace abroad, and now we have 2 major wars ongoing and a couple more on our radar. It has been a wild 4 years. I think I don't think anybody can agree with that. We've been through a lot. I think people forget the scale of what we've all been through. So, in summary, was Biden a good president? In my opinion, no, he was not a good president. He did decently well on the world stage, as many presidents often do, but ultimately his downfall was the problems that were right here at home. Even if he was 100% there, as in he wasn't senile, I don't think that would have changed much for the better. In fact, it might have made it less embarrassing, but in fact, it might have made it even worse, because then you would know all the decisions were made because of his bad judgment. I don't think much would have been changed if he wasn't senile. If I had to compare Biden to another president, the obvious comparisons would be Jimmy Carter or George H.W. Bush, who had their successes diplomatically. George H.W. Bush, that was the president in the 80s and 90s, not the one that was president 20 years ago. They had their successes diplomatically. Carter had the Camp David Accords, and George H.W. Bush had his success in the Gulf War. But those two were brought down by the economy, just as Biden was. And as for his farewell address last week, I won't play any part of it here. That can be found online. But I found that to be incredibly dull and uninspiring. Listening to Reagan's or Obama's was actually exciting, although I wasn't alive during Reagan's. This felt like Biden was shouting into the wind. It was the last shriek on the retreat. I think that's a saying. Already irrelevant, people moved on. And I don't just mean when Trump was elected. I mean people moved on from him 6 months ago. I can't end this episode without mentioning Bidenomics, which was the word used to blame Biden for high inflation, and don't get me wrong, coining it as a phrase was a terrible, terrible idea. My favorite example of them trying to spin Bidenomics before it was ever officially named Bidenomics was this example. On July 1st, 2024, the White House tweeted, quote, "Planning a cookout this year? Catch up on the news." According to the Farm Bureau, the cost of a 4th of July barbecue is down from last year. It's a fact you must heard. The hot dog, the Biden economic plan is working, and that's something we can all relish. How much was it down? Oh, and that's the end of the quote. How much was it down? It was down a whopping 16 cents from the year prior. Yep, it was an actual graphic released by the White House on their official Twitter account. You can find it online. So, in conclusion, let me add a little bit of a deeper layer to Bidenomics that's a bit more nuanced than you heard during the campaign last fall. Bidenomics has a focus on long-term investments in this country, and I talked about it earlier, and I believe those investments will serve us later down the line. Is that something Biden's going to get credit for? I doubt it. Will he deserve it? For the most part, yes. Does that mean that everything that was wrong, does that make it all right? No, and nor should it. Will he do... I do think that Biden's legacy in the short term is going to be the pain and suffering that people faced the last 4 years, particularly the last 3. But the longer term legacy, because people's memories are short, remember that, is a time of economic recovery, low unemployment, and American leadership on the world stage. And I know many of you will disagree with me, but I hope I provided a fair analysis from both political perspectives. Lastly, I want to state that I believe that Biden will probably be better liked in the years to come than he is at this moment. According to Gallup, they have Biden's approval rating at 39%, and 538 has it just under 37%. Consider George H.W. Bush was hated at the end of his term. He has a high approval rating among Democrats these days, despite the fact that he was a Republican. Consider Donald Trump, who was 4 years ago had approval ratings even lower than Biden, was just reelected to the presidency. Am I saying that I think Biden is going to be reelected in 2028? No. I'm just saying that. I think that history will be kinder to Biden than people are right now. At least that's what he's probably hoping. That is, if they don't forget about his presidency, just like Benjamin Harrison's was forgotten because his presidency was sandwiched between Grover Cleveland's 2 terms. He was the last president that was elected to 2 non-consecutive terms. I know for some of you, your long national nightmare is over, but for some of you, it has only just begun. And for some of you, like one of my friends, it is still going. For me, I certainly can't help but feel that our national nightmare is over, but I am not entirely convinced that what is coming will be better either. I certainly hope it is. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.